Welcome back, VisualPolitik community. Every now and then we come across headlines and news stories like these.
17 March 2023, Russia International Criminal Court issues arrest warrant for Putin. 28 June 2023, ICC to resume investigations into alleged crimes against humanity in Venezuela. 7 July 2023, ICC prosecutor seeks to speed up investigation against Burma over Rohingyas.
And the question is, are the international tribunals of any use? Have they yielded any results so far? And could Vladimir Putin really end up behind bars because of a judgment issued in The Hague? Well, in this video, we're going to answer all these questions. But first, the first thing is to know where and how this whole issue of international tribunals began. Let's take a look at a little bit of history.
The first antecedents.
The Ukrainian war has been one of the latest cases to cause international justice to step up to the plate. At the beginning of July 2023, this new initiative was formally launched.
3 July 2023, The Hague opened center to investigate Russia's war in Ukraine. The EU said the center had the ultimate goal of prosecuting those responsible for the invasion of Ukraine.
The International Center for the Prosecution of the Crime of Aggression includes prosecutors from Ukraine, the European Union, the United States, and the International Criminal Court, the ICC. The idea is for this center to gather evidence and prepare charges against Kremlin officials.
We will leave no stone unturned to hold Putin and his henchmen accountable, Ursula von der Leyen.
Now, you may think that this whole international justice story is something quite new, but the truth is that it is not. Ironically, it was Russia itself that started thinking about such initiatives more than 100 years ago. In 1899, in the city of The Hague, Tsar Nicholas II issued a global call for a peace conference to establish a form of international arbitration capable of finding peaceful solutions to all those problems that could end up triggering a war. This led to the creation of the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague. And okay, I know what some of you are thinking, but Josh, what a load of nonsense. How could it be an arbitration court if only a few years later, World War I, and shortly after World War II broke out? What a failure! Well, yes, in a way, you're absolutely right. It was not particularly useful for avoiding wars. In the end, this court of arbitration was basically limited to resolving disputes between different countries over maritime boundaries or the sovereignty of islands. In general, these were relatively minor matters, not least because the countries concerned had to do so voluntarily in order to comply with its provisions. After all, there is no world police force to compel countries to comply with the rulings of this body. If a country simply refused to participate in the process, the story was over. Now, does this all mean that international justice is worthless? Well, take note, because the 100 years that have passed since the peace conference promoted by Tsar Nicholas II have not passed in vain. Vladimir Putin may have one more thing to worry about today, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. The First World War brought with it a level of destruction that seemed unthinkable until then. Perhaps that is why, for the first time in history, the Treaty of Versailles 1919 established 3 articles that, for the first time, opened up the possibility of judging the aggressor states. Specifically, these were Articles 227, 229, and 230. Of course, in the end, they came to nothing. There were some trials, but no convictions. The Allies chose to try to overcome tensions with Germany as quickly as possible. So, no, there were no perpetrators convicted for World War I, or war crimes committed during that war. Nevertheless, tensions did not disappear, and soon after came Nazism and the Second World War, and then everything was different. The Nazi crimes were so absolutely atrocious that in 1945, the London Statute of the International Military Tribunal was signed, where the Allies agreed on the principles and procedures that would govern what we later came to know as the Nuremberg trials. But let's not go so fast, because then came the Cold War. And of course, was there going to be an international tribunal investigating the repressive actions of the Stasi in East Germany, the Soviet intervention in Prague, or the US intervention in Vietnam? Clearly not. And if it had tried, that could have ended with World War III. So what was done was something different. On the one hand, in 1945, the International Court of Justice was created to settle legal disputes between states, and that, in a way, maintained the nature of arbitration, which was already a huge limitation. You see, this international court needed that, when a problem arose, the parties involved agreed to go and respect the jurisdiction of this body. And surprise, surprise, there was the first major problem. Think about it. Is a bank robber going to accept in good faith to be judged and freely accept the sentence? Obviously not. Well, basically, the same thing happens with the states. But that's not even all. On top of that, the UN agreed that the Security Council should, in any case, be the body with the power to deliberate and enforce UN resolutions in particularly serious cases. And since within that body both the United States and the Soviet Union have the right of veto, well, let's just say that in practice, all this international justice only affected minor issues. And so it was until there was a new war in Europe. For this, we have to give a pause of almost 50 years. We are talking, of course, about the war in the former Yugoslavia, a war in which Serbs, Bosnians, and Croats were engaged in an all-out struggle in which allegations of all kinds of crimes abounded. The situation became so bad that in 1993, the Security Council decided to create the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia to prosecute crimes against humanity. Shortly thereafter, in April 1994, one of the bloodiest ethnic conflicts in modern history broke out in Rwanda. The Hutu government systematically murdered 70% of the Tutsi population. We are talking about hundreds of thousands of victims. And just as in the Bosnian case, an international criminal tribunal for Rwanda was set up here as well. In the end, in the Bosnian case, 90 high-ranking civilian and military officials were prosecuted. In the Rwandan case, 61 people were prosecuted. Rwandan Colonel Theonesta Bagosora and the country's prime minister during the massacre, Jean Kambanda, who served as untouchable officials in that context, ended up behind bars, while Yugoslav President Slobodan Milosevic and Serbian leader Radovan Karadzic met the same fate. And yes, during the process, these agencies had many limitations. For example, in the case of Bosnia, not only did the conflict continue after the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia was launched, but 2 years later, the Srebrenica massacre took place. 8,000 Bosnian Muslims were killed in an action carried out by forces allied with Serbia. But in the end, one thing became abundantly clear. If you really wanted to deter and punish crimes, you had to get past the whole arbitration thing. And you needed a body that was permanent and not temporary, like the ad hoc tribunals for Rwanda and Bosnia. International justice needed a genuine court that was capable of conducting investigations and prosecutions unilaterally, and whose judgments were binding. Well, in order to achieve this in 1998, at the request of the United Nations, the Rome Statute was approved, from which the International Criminal Court began to operate in 2002. An organization that was launched with a completely different operation. Although the Security Council or the UN Assembly can refer cases to the court, the UN Prosecutor's Office itself can automatically and unilaterally initiate its own investigations. In other words, it no longer had to have the approval of anyone, neither of the parties involved, nor of the major powers, nor of the Security Council. Theoretically, the leap was galactic. Now, will this body be able to prosecute the Russian hierarchs? Well, let's see.
Dead end.
All this talk of international justice may sound great, but guess what? When it comes down to it, very few governments like to have an international body snooping around in their affairs. And of course, the great powers are a good example. And that's exactly what explains news like this.
22 May 2014, Russia and China veto UN move to take Syria to International Criminal Court. 14 June 2020, Trump authorizes sanctions against ICC officials. The latest move comes months after the ICC authorized an investigation into alleged war crimes committed in Afghanistan by US and Afghan forces.
In fact, although in 1998 the Bill Clinton administration was very active in promoting the Rome Statute, when the time came to ratify it, the Bush administration decided not to do so. The reasons? Well, the US president made it very clear.
You know, as the United States works to bring peace around the world, our diplomats and/or soldiers can be drugged into this court, and that's a very troubling to me. George W. Bush.
And of course, it was not only the United States. Countries such as China, Russia, India, Israel, and Turkey, among many others, have not signed or ratified it either. In fact, today, the Rome Statute is only in force in the countries painted in green. In other words, the International Criminal Court exists, but currently no major power recognizes its jurisdiction. These are the same major powers that could also use their veto to prevent the Security Council from asking the court to investigate concrete cases, which is the option that exists to carry out trials in countries that have not ratified the Treaty of Rome. This is because UN member countries are supposedly obliged to comply with Security Council resolutions. Nevertheless, the court works. Currently, this court has 17 ongoing investigations, including prosecutions for war crimes in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Uganda, Libya, and Sudan, as well as crimes against humanity in Afghanistan, Palestine, and Venezuela. In several of these cases, the court has issued arrest warrants. VisualPolitik viewers, motherland Russia is facing the International Criminal Court, not only in the Ukrainian case, but also regarding alleged crimes committed during its military intervention in Georgia in 2008. And the big question is, to what extent does Putin have to be concerned about what happens in The Hague? Well, stay tuned.
The trip to Kiev ends up in The Hague?
As it stands, the invasion of Ukraine has two open international legal proceedings. One in the International Court of Justice, before which Ukraine denounced the Russian Federation on the 26th of February 2022, asking to protect Ukrainian citizens from possible genocide. On 16th of March 2022, this court ruled that Russia should immediately suspend military operations. Russia, of course, ignored it, so nothing could proceed in that avenue. Meanwhile, the International Criminal Court received the second complaint, although this one did not come directly from the government of Vladimir Zelensky. In the first week of March 2022, ICC prosecutor Karim Khan received multiple requests from the governments of Lithuania, Albania, Australia, Austria, Colombia, Costa Rica, and Finland, among other countries, to launch an investigation into what was happening in Ukraine. This investigation, however, is turning out to be very unusual. In addition to the focus on Putin, the role of Maria Alexeyevna Lvova-Belova, Commissioner for Children's Rights in the office of the President of the Russian Federation, is also being investigated. Both are accused of being the masterminds of the illegal deportation of children from the occupied areas of Ukraine to the Russian Federation.
3 July 2023, Moscow says 700,000 children from Ukraine's conflict zones are now in Russia.
But why is Russia being investigated if this country has not ratified the Rome Statute? Well, because although Russia did not do so, Ukraine, which is the aggrieved country, although it has not yet ratified it, did sign it. What's more, it explicitly accepted the jurisdiction of this body in relation to crimes committed on its territory since 2014, and that allows investigations to continue. So that's what explains the news item that we saw at the beginning of this video. This one.
17 March 2023, Russia, International Criminal Court issues arrest warrant for Putin.
Now, could this warrant be successful? Well, for now, the chances seem slim. Russia does not recognize the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, and this body does not have the capacity to enforce its provisions. In general, up until now, the major powers have been totally indifferent to all these international tribunals without having to face any cost. We could talk about the accusations against the United States for its intervention in Afghanistan and Iraq, the Chinese takeover of Hong Kong, and now the war in Ukraine. And naturally, without the support of the United States, you can imagine that the real capabilities of this organization are very limited. Despite this, in Putin's case, international courts are already actively gathering evidence of human rights violations in Ukraine. Let's say that somewhere in the Netherlands there is a cabinet full of documents that could complicate the impunity of the clique that runs the Kremlin today. If tomorrow the leadership in Russia were to change, Putin could find himself in a very compromising situation, because basically he would not have such an easy time finding refuge. Not least because he will have international arrest warrants issued against him. Nothing is impossible. But remember, Milosevic and Bagazora acted with the same impunity at the time, and ultimately ended up behind bars. But for now, that doesn't seem particularly likely. In any case, having reached this point, we are faced with a final question. Is the International Criminal Court really useful? Well, the truth is that although it is not the most important body in the world, it is serving two purposes. First, to prosecute certain particularly bloody dictators. Although the court is currently holding only 7 people in custody with trials underway, they include Ali Muhammad Ali, Abd al-Rahman, head of Sudanese armed militias, accused of committing 31 war crimes in the armed conflict in that country, and Bosco Ntaganda, Congolese guerrilla leader, also with 12 war crimes to his name. So that's better than nothing. On the other hand, the court has contributed to denouncing the excessive behavior of certain governments. The Putin case is a good example, but so is this one.
International Criminal Court to investigate Venezuela for crimes against humanity. The Hague Prosecutor's Office will settle extrajudicial executions, arbitrary detentions, and torture committed under the Maduro government. International Criminal Court receives more than 2,000 testimonies from victims on investigation of crimes against humanity.
But having come this far, it's now your turn. What do you think about the existence of international courts of justice? Do you think they should be strengthened? Will Putin end up prosecuted and behind bars? Leave us your impressions in the comments and let's open up a debate. Thank you so very much for being there. Take care, and we'll see you next time.